Narcissistic relationships can rattle us to our core. And this video is going to be for childhood trauma survivors who had or they have patterns of getting involved with narcissistic partners or friends or bosses due to our family system of origin trauma conditioning. And a way of dealing with being that rattled is usually about needing to protect yourself by consuming videos or reading literature about narcissism, because really maybe you don't trust yourself and your ability to call it out up front or avoid getting involved with a narcissist in the first place. So here I am creating another video yet again about narcissism, but I want to focus on healing advice and getting your perception back, not focusing on that diagnosis and how they get you. So this video is actually more about you than it is about what to watch out for. So I'm Patrick, I'm a licensed clinical therapist and a life coach, and I specialize in childhood trauma from the family system of origin, how that impacts our adult lives, and how to do healing work. If you like this video, feel free to hit some buttons on the screen. You really can't mess with any of the buttons, specifically the like button, the share button, or the subscribe button. And if you click up here to this white ball, right up here, it's going to take you to an upcoming webinar that I'm doing on Parenting the Inner Child Out of Childhood Trauma. And that's coming up on Saturday, October 15th, 2022. And it's directly related to the content in this video as well. You can also grab my website from the description of this video to find some childhood trauma therapists that are near you that are training with me. You can also find some e-course work that I offer there, my Patreon, as well as a healing community membership that I offer where people connect with me twice a month in a live Q&A. So moving right along, I want to focus on 3 tips that I have about reclaiming trusting yourself and being able to protect yourself from narcissistic jobs or bosses or partners or family members or friends. And I'm not saying that all those folks are NPD. I'm saying they exhibit narcissistic behavior that childhood trauma survivors don't catch for many reasons. So first though, let's reiterate the problem. If you identify with having childhood trauma, I think we're raised in narcissistic families and we're so familiar with off behavior that we're immersed in it to the point that it's really normal for us, we don't see it. And waking up from all that usually involves a hard reckoning, where you realize that one of your parents or a sibling or a grandparent displays narcissistic traits or cluster B symptoms. Having cluster B symptoms doesn't necessarily make you a bad person. It just kind of falls in line with sort of narcissistic traits. That's a hard roller coaster, that reckoning. And you are usually the only family member who sees it, which is also really hard. So this awakening can come from after being involved with a highly narcissistic partner. And with clients, I educate them with how the narcissistic family system sets individuals up to be vulnerable to narcissistic abuse because it's so familiar. So here, I'm not saying that individuals seek out narcissistic abusive relationships on purpose. It doesn't work like that. We don't pop out of bed in the morning from our single life and say, I'm going to start dating a total disaster and not see it and have immense consequences to my mental health or even my physical safety. It doesn't work like that. What I am suggesting is that our inner child or our childhood trauma conditioning or your amygdala, if you like, gets in the way of our perception where we have trouble seeing toxicity up front. And that inner child part of us is also trying to unconsciously, capital U unconsciously, trying to fix something in our childhood which can make us engage in the push-pull with extremely difficult people for many reasons. So here are some examples of how childhood trauma and abuse contributes to not trusting ourselves or our perception, and we end up engaging with narcissistic people. Think about a broken radar system. So in childhood where there is no healthy validation, or you're not being seen as a child, or the adults don't call out abuse themselves. In an abusive family system, kids get treated horrifically and then they become invisible none of that abuse happened. This is about having no healthy adults addressing what just went down for the child, advocacy. And another version is being shamed for telling the truth. so that telling the truth goes so underground to the point that we don't know how to actually tell the truth about what happened anymore. And at a very young age, many of us give up on telling the truth or keep it to ourselves, or we lose it. If there are no healthy adults confirming things with us, we don't know what's real and what's not. Another example is not seeing abusive people being held accountable or called out. Like that rageful, violent stepdad is never challenged, so we learn that the loudest, the most manipulative, the most volatile person has all the power, and that never changes. So diving right in, these tips are like a plan for healing, say, that broken radar system, with the goal of trusting your own perception, trusting your own gut, and not needing to be so vigilant because we now trust ourselves. Moving along, number one is have a safe and sane person to bounce things off of. A solid friend, a solid therapist who gets your history and gets narcissistic abuse, someone we can debrief with, say, after a date or a job interview, where we might be triggered around, maybe be wondering if we got it right or we got it wrong. How I learned to trust my own gut was from a therapist who could help me feel when things were like a big deal and I wasn't feeling that they were a big deal, and they could also help me when I was feeling that things were too much of a big deal and I was kind of going over the top. I was usually focused on the wrong issues due to my own trauma. If my codependency or my inner child was way more forgiving when I shouldn't have been, she'd gently reflect back to me how things sounded to her. And if I get triggered and have a big over-the-top reaction to the friend or the girlfriend or whatever, she'd be able to see that I was triggered and that I was probably projecting in some way. And then she'd kind of ask me like what the trigger would remind me of from growing up. And she would do this in a non-controlling way, and she was encouraging me to think for myself while validating situations and how they sounded to her. She was also very safe to me to hear feedback, so that's important too. Don't pick someone who is just as hypervigilant as you are, because then it just becomes like a big agree fest. Like, yeah, super sketch. So definitely avoid that person who was 10 minutes late. That would trigger me. Pick someone that you respect, or that they have a kind of recovery that you want to learn from or that you want to emulate. We need someone who can challenge us when something sounds off in another person, but also call us out when we sound like we're not seeing the humanity in somebody else. Like being 10 minutes late on a date doesn't have to be such a major red flag. And a bump in the road with this tip is you really have to take your time and pick a good person in this. Like I've had clients who say that they saw a therapist for a long time that didn't get the narcissistic stuff, and they kept encouraging the client to keep trying to work it out with that difficult person, and they missed this huge abusive dynamic that was going on. There's a huge disconnect there. And we should really get this kind of debriefing from our parents if we grew up in healthier systems. Like imagine if we had a safe home base, that in high school you could actually talk to a mom or talk to a dad about how that first date went. And they could help us figure out if we wanted to go on a second date, if we liked them, if they were a good person to date. Not just saying yes to a second date for not knowing what to say to the kid, or not wanting to be single when our other friends aren't. So a parent can kind of like almost like check all that if they were healthy. So a solid friend, a solid therapist, a mentor, someone that you can get good feedback from, and then you can bounce things off of about yourself, right or wrong. The second tip I have is to do a vulnerability inventory. And this is an investigative exercise to figure out how your trauma makes you vulnerable and how to start working with it so that you're not so vulnerable to narcissistic people or difficult people. Inventories, they come from the 12-step world about looking at resentments, which lead an addict to relapse. And it's helpful in that addiction setting of like rigorous self-reflection and being honest about what the addict brings to the table. And this exercise in that setting is called a 4-step. And I know 12-step is not everyone's cup of tea, but it was actually really helpful for me. And FYI, you have to be in a certain place and be ready to do inventory work within the 12-step place, because it's only really concerned with what you brought to the table, which is triggering. It does kind of acknowledge that, yes, people can be a-holes, but it's really triggering, especially when your resentments are involving like abusive family members or perpetrators. It's hard to like do that work and look at what your part is and all that. So I value that work, and I'm just saying it's triggering work. That's all I'm saying. So usually a 12-step inventory consists of 4 columns. Here's how a traditional 12-step inventory columns are set up. The first column is you list the person that you're resentful or people that you're resentful at, like a list, say your ex or toxic boss. The second column is what happened, how it all played out, how it went down. The third column is what did that affect for you? And the last column is what was your part in it? So, and this is usually done in a notebook or whatever. It can be an Excel spreadsheet, and you're creating a list of many resentments you can have, be it people, places, and things. Like you can have a resentment for the university that you went to, or the jobs that you've had, or your exes, or your parents. I think you get it at this point. So there's a bunch of resources online and journals online about doing a 4-step in that traditional 12-step way, all kinds of healthy formats. Let's pretend that you're an addict in recovery from, say, alcoholism, and you're doing this exercise just to show you what it looks like. You've had wreckage and you've caused wreckage. So the person is, say, resentful or simply carries negative feelings for someone named Jill. And why is the second column here. Jill reported you to your boss that you weren't just sick when you called in for the 4th time. You were actually hungover because you drank too much. You guys were out, and that's what happened. But still, her reporting you felt like a betrayal, and you may or may not know that your behavior was sketchy. What did Jill's reporting affect for you? It cost you the job. You took a hit to your self-esteem. It took a hit to your finances. It took a hit to your emotional security. And it definitely took a hit to your pride. The 4th column is what was your part in this? And we're going to tweak this one in the exercise that we'll do about trauma vulnerability. The part here for the alcoholic was dumping work onto Jill when you didn't show up due to your drinking. And you might have had, say, loose boundaries, and you went way too buddy-buddy with her in a fast, dysfunctional way, and you made her like your work BFF. I don't know if this is really specific, but it might sound familiar to you. So you might have had an alcoholic in your life like this. So back to this hypothetical, you were selfish when she told you she'd have to do your work, and then you said you couldn't handle that kind of feedback right now because you were hungover. You had some special rules, like if she was hungover, which she never is, you would never do that to her. You would never do the same thing like report her. Special rules are like manipulations around fairness. And a lot of these behaviors that I'm describing are not just unique to alcoholics. You know, sort of we can, as trauma survivors, we can have these too, or cluster B or whatever. But it's that 4th column that the addict or the alcoholic might gain insight into why things go wrong for them in a relationship or wrong for them in their jobs. It's what their ism brings to the table that is their responsibility. So that's the general idea of this thing. Moving on to our tweaked inventory, we're going to do it a little bit different. Let's do one about the narcissist and someone who has childhood trauma that engages with the narcissist. You know, we'll creatively tweak this 12-step format to reflect our resentment or our wounds being involved with a narcissist. So let's say the survivor here is resentful at their narcissistic ex. Now let's look at the cause. There was love bombing. There was constant on-edge fights, like daily fights being caused by this person. That this person owes them a lot of money and back rent or whatever. That they crossed boundaries and they went to their friends for help, which created like a Cartman triangle. Like the narcissistic person sought rescue from your friends, making you the persecutor. The boundary cross was that they were your friends, not theirs. What did that affect to this 3rd column? It affected the trauma survivor's mental health. Boy, howdy, did it ever, with all the daily triggering. It affected their self-esteem. It affected their finances. It affected their emotional security. It affected their pride. It affected stuff going on in their social circle, like when the narcissist crossed boundaries. The most important part, this 4th column, is the childhood trauma vulnerability. The difference here as opposed to a traditional 12-step, 4-step inventory, is that we're really looking at the childhood trauma symptoms that made us vulnerable to engaging with a narcissist. This is the secret ingredient that we're trying to figure out. So maybe the person's trauma vulnerability is never feeling like they had a home, so they seek out trying to build one with whomever is open to doing that, but not getting that they're trying to build something with someone who is super dysfunctional and unsafe. Or maybe their inner child trauma was around trying to make a miserable parent happy, and that's still running them. Or maybe they fawn and they lose all sense of their inner adult as a biological survival mechanism takes over, and they just submit to whatever the narcissistic person is upset about, submitting to their will, having to do so, say, with a sociopathic or volatile or really troubled parent growing up, or a narcissistic parent. Maybe this person also has a fantasy of being someone's number one for having been a child of extreme neglect, of being scapegoated, where they were never really important in their family system. You may already know what your secret ingredients is from your childhood trauma, which is great, but here are some other possibilities that are more unconscious. Trying to get a toxic person to become sane for your benefit. Like with a troubled, abusive parent, we might do that to try to fix our childhood. If we can make somebody sane, then maybe we've got a little bit of a family going there. Trying to become more tolerable to someone so much that we don't see the toxicity in others is probably really familiar to their family system. Or trying to resolve a drama cycle, So that we're so familiar to the highs and the lows of being okay and then not okay with a caretaker, that we're so in that game that we're committed to that game. We're committed to that kind of cycle. Just like we did with a moody or provocative abusive parent, and we can be kind of attracted to that cycle as well. Another is trying to solve a narcissistic person's problems by being kind to them, so much that we don't see that they bring those problems or those issues to their own life. They cause all that, but you might be trying to be kind and fix it for them, like you had to do with, let's say, a tragic or irresponsible parent. Another is trying to provide for a narcissist who disguises themselves as a victim, because you might over-identify with having been marginalized and you are left without resources in childhood. Another is needing a strong-willed person to tell us what to do with your life, because you've never had someone really advocate for you or have faith in you, and you struggle with making decisions for yourself. Another is attempting to still test or confirm that narcissistic people are just your lot in life, because that's what the family system sort of taught us, that you're kind of testing that you can't do better, which is like self-sabotage. And a couple of really deep-seated runner-ups is having an ego fantasy around being able to handle a super difficult person that shows how determined you are or how tough you can be, even when could be another version of it is when your inner child takes on a narcissistic person to protect others, like you're the sacrificial lamb. Hopefully that stuff made sense. So notice how all of these examples have a codependent nature to them. That they might actually define codependency stemming from childhood trauma itself. So why do all this? Well, the vulnerability that we name that comes from our childhood trauma becomes now the focus in this work. It's like figuring out what your kryptonite is. And then we start to do some healing work around that kryptonite issue in therapy or your self-guided therapy or whatever. If we can name, own, and focus on that vulnerability, that childhood wound, then we can shift out of not needing to be so vigilant around narcissistic people. How powerful would you feel if you didn't have your own sort of private kryptonite in a secret pocket in your system or something like that? And lastly, if you're stuck due to really not knowing about your family system, you can't make that tangible, you can't connect the dots, you can try something called the Family Rules, the Children's Bill of Rights, or doing a genogram, which are all e-courses available on my website. They really help us see an abusive childhood more clearly and be able to connect more dots to the present life. So the third tip and the final tip is to work on how you were set up. In my videos, you often hear me talk about holding parents accountable. Holding abusive parents accountable. What that means is actually a mindset. It's not trying to get your abusive parents to own their part or to try to get them to get it because you told them about your trauma. That's actually also codependency, is when we're fighting people to get them to change. So holding parents accountable is shifting feelings of shame and deep-seated fault, like personal fault, away from ourselves and onto actually how we were parented. And we do that by researching the differences between healthy family systems and toxic ones. Some examples: scapegoated kids are set up for abusive relationships later in life, and or being overly submissive to other people, or they actually can be overly provocative, like in a rebellious way. They were set up for that. Neglected kids are set up to be seeking attention from anyone who will give it, which isn't good. Raise your hand out there if you were already getting yourself into trouble, say in high school, by dating somebody older who was sketchy, but no one in your family knew about it or cared to know about it. Kids who see one parent behave codependently with a narcissistic partner are set up to think that that's how intimacy rolls, to think that that's how a relationship works. Children who are gaslit about the cause and effects of things in the family, like look what you made me do kind of stuff, they're set up to not know where the line is between someone being awful to them, and they become terrible lawyers for themselves. And at the heart of this concept of the setup is, think about your parents now. Would they care if they knew that you were in a really abusive relationship for a while? What would they say about it? Chances are is you would most likely be blamed for getting into that relationship in the first place, or you might get something that's just like, oh, I really liked him. You might want to try to patch that up. I thought that was the best that you can do. That says it all about this stuff. It says it all about the type of family system you might come from. And many of my clients get something similar in retrospect, where you break up with a highly abusive person or a narcissistic person, and then you might have a parent kind of say like, well, I knew they were bad news, I just didn't want to say anything. It's another thing that just says it all about our family systems. So the setup there is still not having anyone from your family in your adulthood really be concerned with your well-being or how your relationships are. And yes, we're adults now, but what I'm referencing is different. Like, this stuff is not new. This is not the blame game or passing the buck. It's really just looking at how toxic families shirk responsibility away from raising well-adjusted human beings, and simply looking at what happens to kids in these situations and what kind of adults do they become. And this exercise is actually writing a letter to one or both of your parents about how the narcissistic partners or bosses or friends you've had, and you actually are holding the parents accountable for setting you up for those relationships. Stuff like, you might write down in the letter, like, I stayed with Jill or Jeff for 5 years, and daily fights and supporting their addiction and supporting them financially, only to have been gaslit every day about how I was the reason they were like that. And you set me up for that because that's what you told me every day growing up, that I was the reason why you were so miserable, that you wished that you had never had me, or that you wished you never got married. I know that cuts deep, but these videos are for individuals who know what I'm talking about because they have heard those things ad nauseum. In this letter that I'm referencing can be anywhere from 3 to 5 pages, and you use it as an exercise to solidify that not only did you not grow up in safety, but that you were set up for any of the following: to not catch narcissistic people up front when they came into your life, to not use your voice, to not get out sooner, to not being in your body enough to know the full impact of what being in a relationship was like with somebody like that. That last one means that we can actually be more in our head dealing with a narcissistic person like a chess game than to be grounded in our body and to fully feel how exhausting and depressing and generally crappy the person makes us feel. So things like that. If you can read the letter to an empty chair and imagine your parent or parents being sitting in that chair, that's the second part of this letter exercise. It's also more powerful to have someone witness you reading the letter to the chair, reading the letter to your parents, who gets this stuff, maybe a therapist or a friend, and because they can witness what you went through, and they can sort of judge the parents for their part in things too. And there'll be a link in the video description that takes you to a sample letter of what I'm referencing to an abusive parent, so that you can get a sense about what that's like. You can just download this letter from that link. So some final thoughts. The work here is not about the narcissist or knowing what to watch out for or why they specifically have a sweaty upper lip when they lie. I just made that up. But it's about doing your work around your abusive family system of origin. I think if we can reclaim our self-worth if we can reclaim our trust in our own perception, if we can get some healing around our attachment or our abandonment issues that stem from this abusive family system stuff, after that, we tend to seek healthier people in our life. We don't have time, we lose interest, or my role with people is to break their tolerance for difficult people. Nothing changed in my romantic relationships until I started finishing business with my parents, who set me up for very messy and difficult partners because of what they modeled around intimacy, and what they modeled around marriage was like this gross, messy power struggle. And I didn't want to get in one of those, so I just became very codependent and very caretaking. So, and also, like I've mentioned, I was really set up to take care of people who refuse to take any responsibility for their own mess or themselves. So I hope that this video was helpful. I hope it actually made sense. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, some comments, and as always, may you be filled with loving kindness, may you be well, may you be peaceful and at ease, and may you be joyous. And I will see you next time.